Hello, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about a right to healthcare. And first, we're going to be going over John Lewis's article. The title of the article is There Is No Right to Healthcare. So, right away, we know where he's going to stand on this issue. Um, his thesis is basically the idea that, look, there's nothing in the Declaration of Independence that will allow us to infer, to conclude that American citizens have a right to healthcare. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that would allow us to conclude that U.S. citizens have a right to health care. In addition, he's going to argue something even stronger. He's going to argue that the right to health care is self-referentially inconsistent. It's self-contradictory. It contradicts itself, right? And I'm going to explain that in a minute. So the most important thing here is, I think, the idea of right. What does it mean to have a right? And as he points out, there are different conceptions, and so what I think is happening, right, and he agrees with this, that we have, some people are working with one conception of rights, and other people are working with another conception of rights. So let's talk about these two different conceptions of rights. So the first one, the basic one, the one that he sort of advocates, is the idea that to have a right is to have a freedom. And he thinks people should have rights. People should have freedoms. The idea of liberty, right? The idea of liberty in the sense of, John Stuart Mill's famous book on liberty. The idea that you have a right, you should have freedom to pursue your life in the way that you see fit, to do the things that you feel are good for you. So you should have your own life projects, and people should not interfere with those life projects. You should have right to property, and people should not interfere with your property. And you should have a right to free expression, right? The right to express your views, your religion. All of these are freedoms, right? Your freedoms. You should have these freedoms. Think about that, and don't forget that. So that's going to be one of his main points, right? So if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you have a right to life, you have a right to liberty, and the right to pursue happiness. These are three freedoms that people have as human beings. They are inalienable rights, right? The idea that they come natural as being human. You're born with these rights, and no one can take them away from you. So that's sort of the idea. And now, the other conception of right is more like a claim right. So I want to say that if I have a right to an education, okay, that means that that it's not just that I have a freedom to an education, but to say that I have a claim right to it means that I have that I can demand, right, someone else to provide it for me. And that someone else obviously is the central government. So if a citizen has a right to an education, which we do in this country, and so the government, right, the power, the central power, then has a moral obligation. And of course, when we talk about the central power, we also talk about the citizens. The other citizens need to make it happen, right? That these children who have a right to an education get an education. Okay, so it's not just like, hey, you can if you want, but if you can't afford it, then it's too bad. No, that's why we have public schools, right? So they should be free because everyone has a right to an education, at least to a certain point. So there's a difference between having a claim right in this sense and having a kind of right sort of privilege or freedom. So, okay, so for instance, let me give you an example. So imagine that I have a claim right to an education, but I can't get to school because my parents don't have a car. If you have a claim right, then the government needs to help you out. They need to have some sort of public transportation available for you, right? Paid by the government, which is ultimately paid by the taxpayers, so that you can get to school because you have a claim right to an education, right? you can demand that the government provide this for you, and the government has to provide not only the education but the means of getting to the school and so on. So that is one sense of claim right. The other sense of right, think about this: I have a right uh, to walk in parks. Okay, that I don't have a claim right to that, but I have a freedom. I have a right to do that. Right? Parks are common areas; they're open to everyone, and I have a right to go to the park, and I have a right to walk in the park and enjoy the park if I want to. So think about both of these, right? So you have a right to an education, you have a right to, recreate in parks or something. Now, in the education one, I have a claim right, so I can demand it, right? And because I can demand it, the government must provide the services necessary for me to obtain that education. In the case of the park, I don't have a claim right. I have a freedom right, the one that I think Lewis is talking about. And so I can't demand that, the government provide transportation for me to go to the park. Uh, People shouldn't interfere with my freedom and liberty to go to the park. That's true because I have a right to do so, but I don't have a claim right to go to the park, right? I can't force other people, or I can't force taxpayers or the government to provide the transportation for me so that I can go to the park, where I can do that for education. Now, the question is, what is healthcare? Is healthcare more like a claim right where I can demand it, right? I can demand that doctors see me and that certain services be provided for my health? Or is it more like the park? I have a right to it. Obviously, if I have money, I can, see any doctor I want, but I can't demand that the government provide that kind of service for me. Now, the point here is that I think Lewis is going to argue that one interpretation of rights he calls egoistic, and not egoistic in the selfish sense, but egoistic in the sense that we're looking out for our self-interest mostly, is the idea of freedom rights. This, and then the other kind of right is altruistic, where it's a right based on needs, right? We're thinking about what people need, and then we're giving them rights to it, and then we're demanding everyone to provide for those people. So those are the two kind of conceptions. And what he wants to say is, look, I mean, I'm not sure what kind of support the idea that that one right is more original or more in terms of its historical precedence. I'm not sure that that makes it more valid or more true. It just seems like they're two different ones, but he wants to argue that this sort of conception of right, claim right, where I have a right to demand things, is kind of a new conception. And he gives us the example, of course, the rights in the Declaration of Independence and the rights in the Constitution are rights in the sense of the egoistic right, the right of freedom, liberty, not the right of claiming entitlement to something. He wants to say, though, look, in the 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you look at that conception of rights, that's a very different conception. It's not about freedom. It's about demanding that every individual, every human being have certain basic needs met, right? And those basic needs met, they have a right to, food, shelter, basic dignity and respect, and so on, right? So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, it says this: everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation in accordance with the organization and resources of each state of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity, the person's dignity, and the free development of his personality. So a person can actually demand this. It is a very different conception. So we have now these two conceptions of rights, And one he calls the rights egoistical forms of rights, or based on the idea of one's freedom, focusing on one's liberties. The other one on altruistic view of rights based on people's needs, right? People, so for instance, he says, and ultimate motivation of assisting another, regardless of one's direct or indirect self-benefit, is necessary for it to be altruistic in the ordinary sense, for what we call moral altruism. So this idea of helping others in need is kind of the foundation of this other conception of rights. Now, there are several other factors involved in this, right? So when we talk about altruistic morality, okay, we're really talking about almost every single moral theory that exists in 20th century, well, 18, 19, 20th century. So if you take the three most important theories, consequentialism, which is within consequentialism, you have utilitarianism, is a form of consequentialism. So that theory says that the right action is the one that's going to benefit the most people. This is an altruistic view because it's concerned with others and the good of others. If you think about deontology, it's the same thing. Our main sort of idea here is going to be moral duties and obligations, and most of these will be our moral obligations to others as well, right? So again, if it's not completely based on altruism or altruistic moral principles, it has a big major part of altruistic kinds of thinking. Of course, we as the self are included in all these theories, so I have a duty to myself as well, of course, but I also have a duty to others. And virtue ethics, again, he thinks, according to him, the virtue ethics is infused with a big kind of dose of altruism as well. And I'm going to read a quote. And altruistic interpretations of such positions dominate moral discourse today. This is what he says. Each position may base its moral claims, and its skills must provide them to others. It must base its moral claims and its understanding of rights upon the premise that people with needed skills must provide them to others, either from duty, for the good of the greatest number, or because it's virtuous to do so. Okay, so think about what he just said. The idea then is, look, if you have these skills, right, and these people need these skills, you have a moral obligation to provide those skills to that people. So he thinks that sort of this whole sort of 20th century moral philosophy is permeated with this notion of sort of matching, benefits with needs, right? And making, okay, now you have an obligation. And he thinks that has influenced the conception of rights, which he thinks originally was just this kind of liberty, right? Now, there's something interesting here. There is the question of whether you have a legal right to something and whether you have a moral obligation to fulfill that right for that person. If the person has a right to something, you might say that you probably have a moral obligation to fulfill that right, or to abstain from obstructing. If the person has a right, if I have a right to this pencil, because I bought it, then you have a moral obligation not to take it from me. Okay? So if I have a right to certain property and the use of certain property, then you have an obligation not to interfere with my property because I have a right to it. But sometimes, even though I don't have a right to something, people could argue, but you might have a moral obligation. So let me give you an example that's pretty famous in other areas of thought. So imagine that a parent gives one of their children a box of chocolates or candy, and the brother or sister asks, the sibling, "Can I have a candy?" Now, you might say, well, the sibling who's asking for a candy doesn't have a right to it because it's not his or hers. But even though they don't have a right, you might still think sharing is actually a good thing. It's something that we ought to do, right? We might, through either religious practice or just through sort of moral common sense, think that if you have 20 pieces of candy and your brother or sister don't have any, that you should share that. You don't have to give them all the candy, but give them one or two. You might think that would be reasonable and morally a moral obligation on your part to give them that candy, even though they don't have a right to it, you see. So it's possible that rights and obligations don't correlate completely in every single case. But what is certain is that if you have a right to it, so if the parent gives the box of chocolates to both siblings, right, to both brothers and to the brother and sister, then they both have a right to half. And here they can demand that the other one give them half the candy. Look, mom gave me half, so half is mine. I have a claim right to that, right? So the question is whether or not, you see, Lewis wants to argue that we may have a moral obligation to help people in need, but certainly the people in need don't have a right to demand that. Okay? We call this charity. Okay? So, well, charity might not work either, because charity might actually be above and beyond the call of duty. So, but certainly it's at least a legal charity. It's not legally obligated, right? So we could have moral charity and legal charity. It's not legally obligated for me to give my money to the poor, but maybe I have a moral obligation to do so. So that's possible. He's okay with that. But what he's not okay with is the idea that legally, you see, that that citizens would have a right to health care. Why? Well, like I said, it's not present in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. Now, think of what he said about the skills and things like that. So, if every single person has a freedom and a liberty to pursue their lives as they see fit, then we want to maximize this freedom. That's our liberty. But our liberty is infringed when we try to apply that other form of right. Because what Lewis is going to argue is, look, how can you have these people saying that these doctors, right, must take care of them? Doesn't that infringe on their rights, right? Doesn't that infringe on their liberties to pursue their career and their lives in the way they want to, right? So there is some sense in which this claim right, based on need and based on altruism, will infringe upon certain rights of the other individuals and citizens in society. Not to mention, of course, the conception of redistribution of wealth and income through taxation. He talks a lot about that. And again, there is the question of entitlement programs and whether they work and whether they're efficient or effective and so on. That, I think, gets us away from the issue, because the issue is whether or not they work or not. That's just a matter of, making them more efficient. The question is whether or not citizens have a right to health care, right? Do they have a claim right so that they can demand that health care be provided to them? So that, I think, is the main issue. Um, Look, we have a right to be protected, right? So we can think about this think of other services that the government provides. I have a right to be protected by the central government. So he never talks about social contract theory, and I think that the social contract theory really comes in handy here. We have certain agreements, right, within society. Now, if somebody comes into my office and threatens me, I should be able to call the police, and the police should come and protect me because that's their job, and the government hires them to do this service. Why? Because I have a right to a certain amount of security and protection, and to live in a peaceful society where we can enjoy, the things that we have and so on and so forth. We need to have certain rights, and some of these rights is the right of security. That is very important, not only domestic but international. But that right infringes on other people, right? I mean, now the police officer who's hired by the county and state has certain obligations that they're not completely free. They have certain moral obligations and legal obligations and a code of ethics that they need to follow. And they will have to get in harm's way, right? Because that's their job, to protect me, right? So it is true that, yeah, he's right, that certain rights that are claim rights, like the right to security, domestic and international security, will put police officers and soldiers in harm's way, and will force them. Of course, this is on a voluntary basis, right? You don't have to be a police officer. But the same thing is true for teachers, right? Teachers also, public school teachers, certain rights are infringed to some extent, right? Because they partake in the societal sort of agreement that, listen, we live in a society, we have given certain rights to certain people, that's going to infringe on our liberties to some extent. So we need people to work in domestic security. We need people to work in international security. We need people to work in public education, and those people who volunteer for those services will have to adapt themselves to what is required of them. And the same thing could be said about the medical profession, right? So medical profession has certain obligations to its citizens, right, and so on. So I'm not sure that his argument works. I mean, it's true, but there's nothing wrong with, I think, the idea that the rights of doctors are infringed upon, just like the rights of teachers and police officers and soldiers are infringed on. So I think the question of whether or not it's fair or it's infringing on people's rights to either to in the medical profession to have these sorts of limitations and restrictions or coercive kinds of behaviors that they have to pursue. You have to attend someone who's dying, right, and comes into that might be infringing on your liberties, right? But those things are not necessarily bad, and certainly they exist in other parts of our society, like in public education and so on. And also, I think the part of the redistribution of wealth is important because he talks a lot about that. So that is an issue. But I think sometimes my view about this is basically that if you think of the social contract position, you see there's no absolute view that is true or correct outside of the social contract. So the social contract is kind of like the sort of rules that society makes to live with one another. And those rules could be whatever we decide is most effective and efficient for the people. And we want to drive on the right side. In England, they drive on the left side, right? So it could be very different in different societies, but the social contract, once the social contract is put into place, those rules become the law in some ways, and they become morality and justice, and everybody has to kind of abide by them. So it could have been different, but it is the way it is. The question is whether we want to have laws or rules that provide health care as a basic necessity for all citizens within the social contract. That might be one way of going about it. Of course, the people that are in favor of health care as a right, they don't want to say that it's just a social contract. They want to say it's an inalienable right. They want to say that you're born with the sort of right to be taken care of in terms of your health and well-being. So a lot to ponder. I kind of skimmed over, some of the arguments and some of the main views, and I hope that it helps you in understanding and reading the article. Thank you.